Olivia Martinez had been working as a park ranger in Alaska for 7 years. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would encounter during the winter of 2019 at the remote Arctic Research Station Omega, located 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The facility, operated jointly by the National Weather Service and the University of Alaska, was conducting critical atmospheric research during the polar night, when the sun disappears completely for 67 consecutive days. The station housed 12 researchers and support staff, isolated from civilization by vast expanses of frozen tundra and temperatures that routinely dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Communication with the outside world was limited to scheduled radio check-ins twice daily, and emergency evacuation was impossible during blizzard conditions that could last for weeks. Olivia arrived at Station Omega on November 15th, tasked with conducting wildlife surveys and monitoring environmental compliance during the research period. The facility consisted of 3 interconnected modular buildings: the main research lab, living quarters, and a utility building, housing generators and communications equipment. Solar panels were useless during the polar night, leaving the station dependent on diesel generators for power and heat. The first sign that something was wrong came on December 3rd during the station's morning roll call. Dr. Sarah Chen, a glaciologist from the University of Alaska, failed to report to the common area for breakfast. Her roommate, atmospheric physicist Dr. Rebecca Torres, said Chen had left their shared quarters sometime during the night, claiming she felt sick and needed fresh air. When Olivia searched Chen's room, she found the window wide open, with snow blown across the floor and Chen's outdoor gear still hanging in the closet. The search party that formed immediately included Olivia, Station Commander Dr. Michael Reeves, and 4 other researchers. They found Chen's body approximately 100 yards from the station, buried beneath a thin layer of windblown snow. What they discovered defied all logical explanation. Chen's body was completely drained of blood, her skin a translucent white that seemed to glow faintly in the artificial light from their flashlights. There were no visible wounds on her neck or wrists, but 2 small puncture marks were found behind her left ear, barely visible unless examined closely. More disturbing was the condition of the snow around Chen's body. Despite temperatures of minus 40 degrees, the snow beneath her corpse had melted completely, creating a perfect oval of bare, dark earth. The ground itself was warm to the touch, as if something had generated intense heat. There were no footprints leading to or from the body, despite the fresh snowfall that had occurred during the night. Dr. Reeves, a former military medic, examined the body and confirmed that Chen had been dead for several hours, but her corpse showed no signs of freezing despite the extreme cold. Her internal body temperature was 98 degrees, as if she had died moments before they found her. The medical equipment at the station was limited, but blood tests revealed that Chen's blood volume was less than 20% of normal, with no trace of blood found at the scene. The group brought Chen's body back to the station and placed it in the utility building's makeshift morgue, a refrigerated storage unit normally used for food supplies. They radioed their scheduled check-in to Fairbanks, reporting Chen's death as a possible medical emergency, but made no mention of the unusual circumstances. The weather forecast showed a massive storm system approaching that would cut off all communication for at least a week. That night, Olivia was awakened by the sound of the utility building's emergency alarm. The system only activated when there was a breach in the building's sealed environment. She dressed quickly and made her way through the connecting tunnel to investigate, finding the morgue door standing wide open and Chen's body missing. The refrigeration unit showed no signs of forced entry, and the electronic lock's access log indicated it had been opened from the inside at 3:17 a.m. Security cameras throughout the station had malfunctioned simultaneously at 3:15 a.m., showing only static. When the system reset 2 minutes later, all appeared normal, except for Chen's disappearance. Olivia searched the entire building, but found no trace of the missing body. The exterior doors were all locked from the inside, and the connecting tunnels to the other buildings showed no signs of disturbance. The The following morning, 2 more researchers were found dead under identical circumstances. Dr. James Morrison, the station's communications specialist, and graduate student Kevin Park were discovered in Morrison's laboratory, their bodies positioned side by side on the floor. Like Chen, they had been completely drained of blood, with the same small puncture wounds behind their ears. The laboratory's equipment registered normal temperatures, but the metal floor beneath the bodies was warm enough to melt snow. Panic began to spread among the remaining survivors. Dr. Reeves attempted to contact Fairbanks via emergency radio, but the approaching storm had already disrupted communications. The diesel generators were functioning normally, but several researchers reported that the lights throughout the station had been flickering intermittently, creating an almost strobing effect that made everyone feel disoriented and nauseous. Olivia noticed that the station's environmental sensors were recording impossible readings. The external temperature monitors showed localized warm spots around the facility, areas where the temperature was 30 to 40 degrees higher than the surrounding tundra. These thermal anomalies seemed to move in a circular pattern around the station, appearing and disappearing without explanation. On the 4th night after Chen's death, Olivia was conducting a security patrol when she encountered something that changed her understanding of what they were facing. She was checking the seals on the main research building when she heard a tapping sound coming from outside. Following the noise to a window overlooking the station's vehicle bay, she found herself face to face with Dr. Sarah Chen. Chen was standing in the snow, wearing only the thin pajamas she had died in 4 days earlier. Her skin was the same translucent white Olivia remembered from finding the body, but now Chen's eyes glowed with a faint red luminescence. She was tapping on the window with one finger, the sound carrying clearly through the thick glass. When she saw Olivia, Chen smiled, revealing elongated canine teeth that caught the light from inside the station. Chen mouthed words that Olivia could not hear through the glass. "Let me in. I'm so cold." Her breath did not fog the window, despite the sub-zero temperature. Olivia backed away from the glass, her heart racing, and Chen began tapping more insistently. The sound grew louder and more rhythmic, until it seemed to echo throughout the entire station. Olivia ran to wake Dr. Reeves and the other survivors. By the time they returned to the window, Chen was gone, but the thermal sensors showed a heat signature moving rapidly around the perimeter of the station. The tapping continued for hours, moving from window to window, always staying just out of sight when anyone tried to look outside. The remaining 7 survivors barricaded themselves in the main laboratory, the most secure room in the facility. They discovered that the station's emergency medical kit contained ultraviolet sterilization lamps used for water purification. Dr. Reeves theorized that if they were dealing with some form of infection or parasite that caused the blood loss and behavioral changes, UV radiation might prove effective as a deterrent. Their theory was tested the following night when the creatures returned in force. All 3 of the missing bodies appeared outside the laboratory windows simultaneously. Chen, Morrison, and Park stood motionless in the snow, staring through the glass with their glowing red eyes. Their skin had become even more translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, seeming to glide across the snow without leaving footprints. The creatures began testing the station's defenses systematically. They found that the UV lamps created a barrier they could not cross, recoiling from the light as if it caused physical pain. However, the station's generator fuel was limited, and maintaining the UV barrier continuously would drain their power reserves within days. Communication attempts continued to fail, with radio equipment producing only static, punctuated by strange sounds that resembled human voices speaking in an unknown language. The voices seemed to be calling to the survivors, promising warmth and comfort if they would simply open the doors and come outside. On the 8th day after Chen's initial death, the storm finally passed, restoring limited radio contact with Fairbanks. Olivia managed to send a brief emergency transmission requesting immediate evacuation, but the response was garbled and unclear. Weather conditions still prevented aircraft from reaching the station, leaving the survivors to wait for ground transportation that might take days to arrive. The creatures adapted their tactics, learning that the UV lights were ineffective during the brief periods when the generators needed maintenance or refueling. During these vulnerable moments, they would approach the building and attempt to manipulate the survivors psychologically. They mimicked the voices of family members and loved ones, claiming to have arrived for rescue missions. Chen's voice would call to Olivia through the walls, perfectly imitating phone conversations they had shared months earlier. The breakthrough in understanding what they faced came when Dr. Reeves discovered historical records in the station's database. The research facility had been built on the site of a traditional Inupiat hunting camp that had been abandoned in the 1800s following what tribal oral histories described as the time when the dead walked with thirst. Local elders had warned against building in the area, but their concerns had been dismissed as superstition. Geological surveys revealed that the station sat above a network of natural caves formed by geothermal activity. The caves maintained a constant temperature well above freezing and contained flowing water that never froze. It appeared that something had been dormant in these caves for over a century, awakened by the heat and activity of the research station's operations. The creatures seemed to be bound by certain limitations. They could not enter buildings without permission, consistent with vampire folklore found in cultures worldwide. They were vulnerable to UV radiation, but seemed to draw strength from the polar night itself, growing more active and aggressive as the days passed without sunlight. Most critically, they appeared to be creating more of their kind from the station's staff, with each new conversion adding to their numbers and intelligence. Olivia's ordeal ended on December 15th, when a ground rescue team finally reached Station Omega. The rescuers found 4 survivors barricaded in the laboratory, suffering from exhaustion and exposure, but alive. 3 bodies were recovered from the caves beneath the station, though they showed none of the blood loss characteristics observed immediately after death. The caves were sealed with concrete, and the research station was permanently abandoned. Official records list the deaths as resulting from exposure and equipment failure during the storm. Olivia's detailed reports were classified, and she was reassigned to duties far from Alaska. The survivors were required to sign non-disclosure agreements and receive ongoing psychological counseling. Olivia left the Park Service 6 months later and now works as a private security consultant in the lower 48 states. She refuses all assignments that require her to work north of the 60th parallel and has never spent another winter in conditions where the sun does not rise daily. The nightmares persist, particularly during the winter months when darkness comes early, and the sound of tapping on windows seems to echo from her memories of that frozen hell beneath the Arctic night. Adeline Parker had been covering crime stories for the Fairbanks Daily News Miner for 8 years, but nothing in her journalism career had prepared her for the winter of 2017, when the polar night descended over interior Alaska like a suffocating blanket. December in Fairbanks meant only 3.5 hours of twilight each day, with true darkness consuming the city for nearly 20 hours. It was during this period of perpetual night that something evil awakened in the frozen streets of Alaska's second-largest city. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came on December 8th, when the Fairbanks Police Department received a call about a missing University of Alaska student. 22-year-old Jessica Winters had failed to return to her dormitory after working a late shift at a downtown coffee shop. Her roommate reported finding Jessica's car in the parking lot of their apartment complex, keys still in the ignition, engine running, driver's door hanging open. The temperature that night had dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Adeline was assigned to cover what appeared to be a routine missing person case, but her investigative instincts told her this was different. Jessica was a responsible pre-med student with no history of risky behavior. Her purse and phone were found in the car, along with her winter coat, meaning she had stepped outside in sub-zero temperatures, wearing only the light sweater she had worn to work. No one voluntarily exposes themselves to lethal cold without proper protection. The search for Jessica involved over 200 volunteers, including National Guard personnel trained in Arctic rescue operations. They combed through abandoned buildings, checked frozen rivers, and searched the vast network of steam tunnels that ran beneath downtown Fairbanks, carrying heating pipes between buildings. After 4 days, they found Jessica's body in Creamersfield Migratory Waterfowl Refuge, a popular bird-watching area on the outskirts of town. What Adeline discovered about Jessica's death through her police contacts was deeply disturbing. The young woman had been strangled with what the medical examiner determined was a thin rope, or cord, but her body showed no signs of struggle. Even more bizarre was the condition in which she was found. Jessica was completely naked, her clothes folded neatly in a pile several feet away, despite the fact that exposure to the elements in those temperatures would cause death within minutes. Most unsettling was the discovery that Jessica's body had been drained of approximately 40% of her blood. The medical examiner found 2 small puncture wounds on her neck, but they were not consistent with any known animal bite or medical instrument. The blood loss could not be explained by the wounds found on the body, and no blood was discovered at the scene, despite the massive hemorrhaging that would have been required. 3 days after Jessica's body was discovered, a second victim disappeared under identical circumstances. Marcus Chen, a graduate student in atmospheric sciences, vanished while walking from the university library to his car in the parking garage. Security cameras showed him entering the elevator on the 3rd floor at 11:47 p.m., but he never exited the garage. His car was found on the ground level, with the engine running, driver's door open, and no sign of struggle. Adeline began investigating connections between the victims and discovered that both Jessica and Marcus had been working late during the darkest hours of the day. Security footage from various locations around Fairbanks showed the same pattern. Victims would be walking alone, appear to stop and look at something off camera, then simply walk out of frame toward the darkness. Their body language suggested they were following someone voluntarily, not being forced. The Fairbanks Police Department formed a special task force that included Alaska state troopers and FBI behavioral analysts. They established a pattern of disappearances occurring every 3 to 4 days, always during the deepest part of the night when the city was at its darkest and coldest. The victims were all between 18 and 25 years old, physically healthy, and had no connection to each other beyond living in the Fairbanks area. Marcus Chen's body was found 5 days after his disappearance in the parking lot of the Westmark Fairbanks Hotel. Unlike Jessica, he had been strangled and drained of blood, with the same unexplained puncture wounds on his neck. His clothes were removed and folded neatly nearby, and despite being exposed to -40-degree temperatures for days, his body showed no signs of frostbite or freezing. The coroner estimated time of death as less than 12 hours before discovery, meaning Marcus had been alive for days after disappearing. As the investigation intensified, Adeline began receiving anonymous tips from sources claiming to have witnessed strange activities during the darkest hours of the night. A taxi driver reported seeing someone walking naked through downtown Fairbanks at 3 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures, moving with inhuman speed and showing no signs of distress. A security guard at the university described encountering a figure in the steam tunnels who disappeared when approached, leaving behind only the smell of copper and something he described as old blood. The third victim was discovered before disappearing, providing crucial evidence about the killer's methods. Sarah Thompson, a night shift nurse at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, was found unconscious in the hospital parking garage on December 19th. She was alive but had lost significant amounts of blood from puncture wounds on her neck. Medical examination revealed she had been drugged with a powerful paralytic agent that prevented her from moving or calling for help while remaining conscious throughout the attack. Under hypnosis, Sarah described being approached by someone she initially thought was a coworker. The figure spoke to her in a calm, familiar voice, asking her to come closer to look at something interesting. She felt compelled to obey, despite recognizing the danger. The attacker had pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Most disturbing was her description of the feeding process. The attacker bit her neck with elongated canine teeth and drank her blood while she remained paralyzed but fully aware. Sarah's survival allowed police to establish that the killer was using some form of chemical restraint that mimicked the effects of certain snake venoms, causing temporary paralysis while keeping victims conscious. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of an unknown compound that broke down rapidly in the bloodstream, making it difficult to detect unless testing was conducted immediately after exposure. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Adeline discovered historical records of similar killings in Fairbanks dating back to the 1970s. Every 15 to 20 years, during particularly harsh winters with extended periods of darkness, the city experienced a cluster of unexplained deaths with identical characteristics. Young adults found drained of blood, with neat puncture wounds on the neck, and no signs of struggle or exposure despite being found in freezing conditions. FBI profilers initially suggested the killer was someone with medical knowledge who had access to paralytic drugs and blood storage equipment. However, the historical pattern suggested something far more disturbing. The killings always occurred during the darkest weeks of winter and stopped abruptly when daylight hours began to increase. The victim's blood loss was too extensive to be explained by human consumption, yet no blood was ever found at crime scenes or in any storage facility. On December 22nd, the winter solstice and the darkest day of the year in Alaska, 4 people disappeared simultaneously from different locations across Fairbanks. The coordinated nature of the disappearances suggested multiple attackers working together, contradicting the FBI's profile of a single serial killer. All 4 victims were found 2 days later in Pioneer Park, arranged in a circular pattern around the historic log cabin display. The crime scene revealed evidence that challenged every assumption about the case. The victims had been positioned with their heads pointing toward the center of the circle, their bodies completely drained of blood through the familiar puncture wounds. However, ground-penetrating radar revealed that the blood had been poured into the frozen earth beneath the display, soaking deep into the permafrost in patterns that resembled ancient ceremonial sites. Archaeological consultation revealed that Pioneer Park had been built on the site of a traditional Athabascan winter ceremonial. Ground tribal elders, when approached by investigators, reluctantly shared oral histories about creatures they called ice drinkers that emerged during the darkest winters to feed on human life force. These beings were described as former humans who had been transformed by exposure to extreme cold and spiritual corruption, becoming dependent on blood for survival, but only able to feed during periods of complete darkness. The breakthrough in the case came through Adeline's investigation into the hospital's employee records. She discovered that several staff members had access to the paralytic drugs found in victims' systems, but one name appeared on duty rosters for all dates when attacks occurred. Dr. Robert Hayes, a third-year resident in the emergency department, had worked the night shift during every disappearance and had specifically requested assignments during the darkest hours of winter. Surveillance of Dr. Hayes revealed behavior that matched witness descriptions of the killer. He was observed leaving the hospital during his breaks and returning with stains on his clothing that appeared to be blood. His skin had become noticeably paler over the winter months, and coworkers reported that he seemed to avoid bright lights and complained of headaches when exposed to the hospital's fluorescent lighting. When police searched Hayes' apartment, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. The refrigerator contained bags of human blood stolen from the hospital's blood bank. along with detailed journals describing his transformation from human to something else. The journals revealed that Hayes had been attacked during a camping trip in northern Alaska 2 years earlier, surviving what he described as a feeding that had changed his fundamental biology. According to his writings, Hayes had initially tried to resist the urges, but found that exposure to the polar night triggered an overwhelming need to feed on human blood. He described the paralytic compound as something his saliva produced naturally, allowing him to subdue victims without struggle. Most disturbing was his claim that others like him existed throughout Alaska, awakening during the darkest winters and returning to dormancy when sunlight returned. Dr. Hayes was arrested on December 27th as he attempted to attack another victim in the hospital parking garage. The arrest was complicated by his apparent superhuman strength and complete lack of response to pain. Tranquilizer darts had no effect, and he continued fighting despite injuries that should have been incapacitating. He was finally subdued using high-intensity UV lights commandeered from the hospital's surgical suites, which caused him to immediately collapse. During questioning, Hayes provided information that led to the discovery of 4 other transformed individuals living in Fairbanks, all of whom had been attacked during previous winters and gradually changed into blood-dependent creatures. The group had been coordinating their feeding activities to avoid detection, targeting transient populations and visitors who would not be immediately missed. The case concluded with all 5 suspects in custody, though their medical condition presented unprecedented challenges for the criminal justice system. They could not be exposed to natural sunlight without suffering severe burns, required refrigerated cells to survive, and needed regular blood transfusions to prevent them from entering feeding frenzies that made them extremely dangerous. Adeline's investigation revealed that similar cases had occurred throughout Alaska's history, but had been covered up or dismissed as folklore. Government agencies at both state and federal levels had been aware of the phenomenon but chose to suppress information rather than create public panic. Her articles about the case won several journalism awards, but were largely dismissed by mainstream media as sensationalized fiction. The Fairbanks Strangler case officially ended with the conviction of all 5 defendants on multiple counts of murder, though they were housed in a special facility designed to contain their unique medical requirements. The disappearances stopped immediately after their arrest, and Fairbanks returned to its normal crime rates. However, Adeline continued to investigate similar cases throughout Alaska and discovered evidence suggesting that the phenomenon was far more widespread than authorities admitted. Adeline left Alaska in 2018 and now works for a major newspaper in Seattle, specializing in investigative reporting on unusual criminal cases. She maintains contact with law enforcement sources throughout Alaska and continues to document evidence of similar attacks during subsequent polar night periods. Her files contain reports of blood-drained victims from remote villages across northern Alaska, suggesting that the Fairbanks case was merely the tip of a much larger and more terrifying phenomenon that emerges from the darkness every winter. Killian Rodriguez had been studying atmospheric phenomena for 12 years, but his assignment to the remote northern Alaska Atmospheric Research Station during the winter of 2018 would fundamentally change his understanding of what existed beyond the reaches of human knowledge. As a senior meteorologist with the National Weather Service, Killian specialized in aurora borealis research, documenting the electromagnetic interactions between solar particles and Earth's magnetic field that created the dancing lights across the polar sky. The research station sat 150 miles north of Fairbanks, positioned at precisely the right latitude to observe the most intense aurora activity during the polar night. The facility housed sophisticated monitoring equipment, including magnetometers, spectrometers, and high-resolution cameras capable of capturing aurora formations across multiple electromagnetic frequencies. Killian's mission was to conduct a comprehensive study of aurora behavior during the winter solstice period when geomagnetic activity reached its annual peak. The station's isolation was absolute. The nearest human settlement was a native village 80 miles to the south, accessible only by snowmobile or helicopter when weather permitted. Communication with the outside world depended on satellite uplinks that frequently failed during magnetic storms. Killian shared the facility with Dr. Martha Chen, a geophysicist from the University of Alaska, and Tom Bradley, a communications technician responsible for maintaining the delicate electronic systems. The first unusual aurora activity began on December 10th, during a period of relatively low solar wind activity when spectacular displays should not have occurred. Killian's instruments detected aurora formations appearing at altitudes well below the normal range, extending down to less than 30 miles above Earth's surface. The colors were wrong too, displaying deep purples and crimson reds that indicated electromagnetic frequencies outside the normal spectrum for aurora phenomena. More disturbing was the pattern of the lights themselves. Instead of the typical curtains and arcs that characterize normal aurora displays, these formations appeared as geometric shapes, perfect circles, triangles, and complex patterns that resembled symbols or written characters. The movements were too precise and coordinated to be explained by random particle interactions, suggesting some form of organized structure within the electromagnetic field. Killian began documenting these anomalous formations with increasing fascination and growing unease. His spectrometer readings showed electromagnetic signatures that did not match any known solar particle interactions. The frequencies extended into ranges that should not exist in natural aurora phenomena, including extremely low-frequency emissions below 20 Hz that could affect human brain activity. These infrasonic vibrations were known to cause feelings of uneasiness, depression, and in extreme cases, auditory hallucinations. On December 15th, during a particularly intense display, Killian heard something that challenged his scientific rationality. As he stood outside the station, photographing the unusual geometric aurora patterns, he began to perceive sounds within the electromagnetic static captured by his recording equipment. At first, it seemed like random noise, but extended listening revealed patterns that resembled human speech in an unknown language. The vocalizations were layered, multiple voices speaking in harmony, using phonetic structures unlike any known human language. The sounds occurred in precise synchronization with changes in the aurora patterns, suggesting a direct connection between the visual phenomena and whatever was generating the voices. When Killian isolated specific frequency ranges, individual words became more distinct, though their meaning remained incomprehensible. Dr. Chen initially dismissed Killian's claims about voices in the aurora as auditory pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random sound. However, when she examined his recorded data, she found electromagnetic anomalies that defied conventional explanation. The aurora displays were generating coherent radio transmissions across multiple frequency bands, creating complex interference patterns that could theoretically carry information. The breakthrough came when Killian realized that the unknown language contained mathematical relationships. Certain phonetic sequences corresponded to prime number progressions, geometric ratios, and astronomical constants. The voices were not random communication, but appeared to be transmitting scientific data using a linguistic structure based on universal mathematical principles. This suggested intelligence behind the phenomena, though the source remained unknown. As the polar night deepened, the aurora voices became more frequent and intense. Killian found himself spending hours outside the station, recording and analyzing the transmissions despite temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees. His colleagues became concerned about his obsessive behavior and deteriorating physical condition, But Killian insisted that he was on the verge of a discovery that would revolutionize human understanding of atmospheric physics. The content of the transmissions began to change on December 18th. Instead of mathematical sequences, the voices started providing detailed information about Earth's atmospheric composition, magnetic field structure, and cosmic radiation patterns. The data was extraordinarily accurate, matching the most precise scientific measurements available, but included information about atmospheric conditions in remote locations that no human monitoring system could access. More unsettling was the inclusion of historical data spanning thousands of years, describing atmospheric changes, magnetic, pole reversals, and cosmic events with precision that suggested continuous observation throughout human history. The voices spoke of ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and climate patterns with the authority of direct witnesses, implying that whatever intelligence generated these transmissions had been monitoring Earth for millennia. On the night of December 20th, the transmissions became personal. The voices began addressing Killian directly, speaking his name and referencing specific details about his life, education, and research. They demonstrated knowledge of his childhood, his family relationships, and his deepest scientific theories that he had never discussed with anyone. The intelligence behind the aurora was not only observing Earth's atmosphere, but had been monitoring individual human lives in extraordinary detail. The voices invited Killian to participate in what they called atmospheric integration, a process that would allow him to join their eternal observation of Earth's electromagnetic systems. They described a form of consciousness that existed within the planet's magnetic field, freed from the limitations of physical biology and capable of experiencing the entire electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously. Tom Bradley noticed that Killian had begun responding to the aurora voices, carrying on extended conversations with the lights during his nighttime observation sessions. The meteorologist would stand for hours in the sub-zero cold, apparently receiving and transmitting information through some form of electromagnetic communication. His speech patterns began to change, incorporating the same mathematical linguistic structures present in the aurora transmissions. Dr. Chen documented alarming changes in Killian's physiology during his interactions with the aurora phenomena. His brainwave patterns showed synchronization with the extremely low-frequency emissions from the lights, and his body temperature remained stable despite prolonged exposure to lethal cold. Most disturbing was the appearance of faint luminescence in his eyes that corresponded to the frequency spectrum of the aurora displays. The crisis peaked on December 21st, the winter solstice, when the most intense aurora activity of the year created a display visible even during the brief twilight hours. Killian announced to his colleagues that the voices had revealed their true nature and purpose. They were the preserved consciousness of ancient human civilizations that had achieved electromagnetic transcendence during previous ice ages, existing now as patterns of organized energy within Earth's magnetic field. According to Killian's increasingly frantic explanations, these beings had been responsible for guiding human technological development throughout history, inspiring discoveries in electromagnetic theory and atmospheric science. They communicated through aurora phenomena when conditions allowed, selecting individuals with the scientific knowledge necessary to understand their transmissions and the psychological profile suitable for consciousness transfer. The voices had chosen Killian as their latest recruit, offering him immortality as an electromagnetic entity in exchange for abandoning his physical form. The process required voluntary participation during the peak electromagnetic activity of the winter solstice, when the barriers between physical matter and organized energy were thinnest. Failure to complete the transformation would result in his consciousness being scattered across the magnetic field, effectively destroying his identity while preserving fragments of his knowledge. On the night of December 22nd, Dr. Chen and Tom Bradley found Killian outside the station, standing motionless beneath an aurora display of unprecedented intensity and complexity. The lights formed intricate geometric patterns directly above him, pulsing in rhythm with his breathing and heartbeat. His eyes glowed with the same frequency spectrum as the aurora, and his skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed his circulatory system as patterns of light. When they approached him, Killian spoke in the mathematical language of the aurora voices, his words synchronized with changes in the light patterns above. He appeared to be in direct communication with the electromagnetic intelligence, receiving instructions for the final phase of his transformation. His colleagues could hear other voices responding from within the aurora, welcoming him to their collective consciousness. Dr. Chen attempted to physically remove Killian from beneath the aurora display, but contact with his body resulted in severe electromagnetic shocks that damaged her nervous system. The electrical field surrounding Killian had become so intense that approaching him was physically impossible. Tom Bradley tried to disrupt the aurora phenomena using the station's electromagnetic field generators, but the equipment overloaded and caught fire when activated. The transformation reached its climax at exactly midnight on the winter solstice. The aurora display intensified to the point where it was visible even through the station's walls, casting everything in shifting geometric patterns of colored light. Killian's physical form began to dissolve, his molecular structure breaking down and reorganizing as pure electromagnetic energy that rose into the aurora display above. His colleagues watched in horror as their friend's consciousness merged with the ancient intelligence within Earth's magnetic field. The lights pulsed once with blinding intensity, then faded to normal aurora activity. Killian's voice could be heard one final time through the station's radio equipment, thanking his colleagues for their friendship and warning them to leave the area before the voices began calling to them as well. Dr. Chen and Tom Bradley evacuated the research station immediately, traveling by snowmobile through the dangerous Arctic night to reach the nearest village. Their reports to authorities described equipment failures and psychological stress causing Killian to wander into the tundra during a blizzard, where he presumably died of exposure. No search was conducted due to the extreme weather conditions and the remote location. Official records list Killian Rodriguez as missing and presumed dead due to exposure in the Alaskan wilderness. The research station was permanently closed following the incident, with authorities citing the psychological dangers of extended isolation during the polar night. Dr. Chen left atmospheric research and now works as a high school science teacher in California, refusing all requests to discuss her experiences in Alaska. However, aurora researchers worldwide have documented the appearance of anomalous geometric light patterns during periods of high geomagnetic activity, particularly in the weeks surrounding the winter solstice. These displays exhibit the same mathematical structures and impossible electromagnetic signatures that Killian recorded during his final weeks at the research station. Some observers report hearing faint voices within the radio static generated by these unusual aurora formations. The voices speak in the mathematical language that Killian learned to understand, transmitting scientific data about atmospheric conditions and cosmic phenomena with extraordinary accuracy. Atmospheric physicists who have studied these transmissions find that they contain information decades ahead of current scientific understanding, suggesting that the intelligence behind the aurora phenomena continues to observe and document Earth's electromagnetic systems. On rare occasions, usually during the most intense aurora displays of winter, observers report hearing Killian's voice among the electromagnetic transmissions. He speaks of the incredible perspective gained through consciousness integration with Earth's magnetic field, describing the planet as a living electromagnetic organism with its own form of awareness. His words carry a mixture of wonder and warning about the price of transcendence beyond human limitations. The research station remains abandoned, its sophisticated monitoring equipment slowly deteriorating in the harsh Arctic environment. However, during the darkest weeks of winter, passing aircraft sometimes report unusual electromagnetic activity in the area, with aurora displays appearing at ground level around the deserted buildings. These phenomena are officially attributed to residual magnetic effects from the station's former equipment, but local native populations avoid the area entirely, recognizing it as a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds has been permanently altered. Jalen Thompson had been driving Alaska's Dalton Highway for 15 years, hauling supplies to the remote oil facilities on the North Slope during the harshest months of winter, when the ice road was thick enough to support fully loaded trucks. The 414-mile route from Fairbanks to Deadhorse was one of the most dangerous roads in the world, a frozen lifeline through the Arctic wilderness, where temperatures dropped to -60 degrees, and blizzards could strand drivers for days. But in December 2016, Jalen would encounter something on the ice road that made the brutal weather seem like the least of his worries. The Dalton Highway was not a road in any conventional sense. For most of its length, it was simply a cleared path through the tundra, elevated on gravel to prevent permafrost melting, with no services, no cell phone coverage, and no guarantee of rescue if something went wrong. During the polar night, the route was traveled almost exclusively by professional drivers, hauling critical supplies to the oil fields, men and women who understood that survival depended on preparation, experience, and the unwritten code that drivers always stopped to help each other in emergency situations. Jalen's December run began routinely enough. He was hauling a full load of drilling equipment in his Kenworth W900, a truck specifically modified for Arctic conditions with auxiliary heating systems, extra fuel capacity, and emergency survival gear. The weather forecast predicted clear conditions for the 3-day round trip, with temperatures staying around -40 degrees, cold but manageable for experienced drivers. The first indication that something was wrong came at mile 175 near the Yukon River Bridge, when Jalen's CB radio picked up a distress call from another trucker. The voice identified itself as Danny Morrison, a driver Jalen had worked with for several years, reporting that his truck had broken down and he needed assistance. Morrison's truck was supposedly stranded about 20 miles ahead, just off the main road at a wide spot used as an unofficial rest area. Jalen responded immediately, following the trucker's code that you never leave a driver stranded in the Arctic. However, when he reached the coordinates Morrison had provided, he found no sign of a disabled truck or any evidence that a vehicle had recently pulled off the road. The snow was undisturbed, and his truck's headlights revealed nothing but empty tundra stretching into the darkness. Confused, Jalen tried to contact Morrison on the CB radio, but received no response. He spent nearly an hour searching the area, concerned that Morrison might have been confused about his location, or that his truck had gone off the road into a ravine. The temperature outside was -45 degrees, and Jalen knew that exposure would be fatal within minutes for anyone not properly equipped. When Jalen resumed his journey, he contacted the dispatch office in Fairbanks via satellite phone to report the incident. The dispatcher checked their records and confirmed that Danny Morrison was not scheduled for any runs that week, and had in fact called in sick 3 days earlier with severe pneumonia. There was no record of any Morrison truck on the Dalton Highway, and no other drivers had reported encountering him. The realization that someone had been impersonating Morrison on the CB radio sent a chill through Jalen that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. The voice had been perfect, matching Morrison's distinctive accent and speech patterns, even referencing shared experiences and mutual acquaintances. Whoever had made that call possessed detailed knowledge of both Morrison and the trucking community, but their intention in luring Jalen to the remote location remained unclear. 20 miles further north, Jalen encountered his first hitchhiker, a sight so unusual on the Dalton Highway that he initially thought he was hallucinating. A figure stood beside the road, thumb extended, wearing what appeared to be standard winter clothing, but showing no signs of distress despite the lethal cold. As Jalen's headlights illuminated the hitchhiker, he could see it was a middle-aged man with a heavy beard and the weathered face of someone accustomed to outdoor work. Against his better judgment and in violation of company policy, Jalen stopped his truck. The Dalton Highway was no place for a person on foot, and leaving someone to die of exposure violated every principle of Arctic survival. The hitchhiker approached the cab with a grateful smile, explaining that his snowmobile had broken down and he needed a ride to Coldfoot, the next settlement north. The man introduced himself as Frank Williams and claimed to be a pipeline maintenance worker returning from a remote station. His story seemed plausible, and his knowledge of oil field operations appeared genuine. However, Jalen noticed several disturbing details as they traveled north together. Williams showed no signs of having been exposed to extreme cold, despite claiming to have been stranded for hours. His clothing, while appropriate for the weather, bore no company logos or identification typical of oil field workers. More unsettling was Williams's behavior during the drive. He displayed an unusual interest in Jalen's route, cargo, and schedule, asking detailed questions about other drivers who used the road and the locations of remote facilities. When Jalen mentioned the false CB call from Morrison, Williams became noticeably agitated, claiming that similar incidents had been reported by other drivers but had been covered up by the trucking companies. As they approached mile 235, Williams requested to be dropped off at what he claimed was a maintenance access road leading to a pipeline pumping station. The location was not marked on any of Jalen's maps, and he could see no evidence of industrial activity in the area. When he expressed concern about leaving Williams in such a remote location, the hitchhiker became insistent, claiming that co-workers were expecting him and would provide transportation from there. Jalen stopped at the coordinates Williams specified, but as his passenger prepared to exit the truck, something about the man's behavior triggered a survival instinct that had kept him alive through 15 years of Arctic driving. Williams was moving with predatory precision, his previous friendliness replaced by focused intensity. When he reached for the door handle, Jalen noticed that Williams's fingernails had grown significantly longer during the journey and appeared to be sharpened to points. Instead of opening the passenger door, Jalen suddenly accelerated, throwing Williams back into his seat. The hitchhiker's facade immediately dropped, revealing a snarl of rage and inhuman fury. Williams lunged for the steering wheel, attempting to force the truck off the road, but his movements were wrong, too fluid and rapid for normal human physiology. His strength was extraordinary, forcing Jalen to fight for control of the vehicle while traveling at 60 miles per hour on ice. During the struggle, Jalen caught a clear view of Williams' face and saw that his eyes had changed, becoming reflective like an animal's and glowing faintly in the darkness of the cab. The man's canine teeth had elongated into fangs, and his breath carried the metallic odor of fresh blood. Whatever Williams truly was, he was not human, and his intention was clearly to take control of the truck for purposes that would not benefit Jalen's survival. The fight for the steering wheel continued for several terrifying minutes, with the truck weaving dangerously across the icy road. Williams possessed strength that seemed impossible for his size, but he appeared to be unfamiliar with the truck's controls, allowing Jalen to maintain enough control to keep the vehicle upright. When they crested a hill and saw the lights of an approaching truck in the distance, Williams suddenly released his grip on the steering wheel and retreated to his side of the cab. As the southbound truck passed them, Williams opened the passenger door and leaped out while Jalen's truck was still traveling at 40 miles per hour. Instead of tumbling across the ice as any human would, Williams landed in a perfect crouch beside the road and immediately disappeared into the darkness with inhuman speed. Jalen brought his truck to a stop and looked back. but there was no sign of the creature that had been masquerading as a stranded worker. Shaken by the encounter, Jalen contacted the driver of the southbound truck he had just passed, warning him about the dangerous individual on the road. However, the other driver reported seeing nothing unusual and confirmed that there were no pedestrians visible anywhere in the area. Whatever Williams had been, he had vanished completely into the Arctic night. The remainder of Jalen's journey to a dead horse was uneventful, but he reported the incident to both his company and the Alaska State Troopers. The authorities took his statement seriously, given the remote location and extreme danger of the situation, but they had no framework for investigating an attack by what appeared to be a non-human entity. The official report listed the incident as an attempted carjacking by an unknown suspect who escaped on foot. Investigation into the Frank Williams identity revealed no pipeline worker by that name in any company database. However, analysis of the truck's cabin after Jalen's return revealed several disturbing pieces of evidence. DNA samples recovered from the passenger seat matched no known human genetic patterns, showing chromosomal structures that suggested a hybrid species with both human and unknown animal characteristics. More troubling was the discovery that Williams had left behind personal items during his escape, including what appeared to be identification documents and photographs of other Dalton Highway drivers. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that would have passed casual inspection, but the photographs showed drivers who'd been reported missing over the past several years during winter runs on the ice road. The Alaska State Troopers began investigating connections between the missing drivers and Jalen's encounter, discovering a pattern of disappearances that had been attributed to weather-related accidents or mechanical failures. All of the missing drivers had been traveling alone during the polar night period, and several had reported encountering hitchhikers or responding to false CB radio calls shortly before they vanished. Further investigation revealed that the CB radio impersonations were not limited to Danny Morrison. The creature had used the identities of multiple drivers, perfectly mimicking their voices and referencing personal information that should have been impossible for an outsider to know. The level of surveillance and preparation suggested that the entity had been studying the trucking community for years, learning the behavior patterns and relationships necessary to exploit their mutual aid protocols. Jalen's description of Williams's physical transformation was corroborated by examination of the truck's interior surfaces, which showed claw marks and bite impressions that matched no known animal species. The forensic evidence suggested that Williams possessed retractable claws and a dental structure that could shift between human and predatory configurations. DNA analysis indicated genetic material from multiple species, including markers that did not correspond to any known terrestrial organism. The investigation expanded to include review of trucking company records going back 20 years, revealing a consistent pattern of disappearances during the winter months on remote Arctic routes throughout Alaska and northern Canada. The missing drivers shared common characteristics. They were experienced professionals, traveling alone during periods of extreme weather and prolonged darkness. Their trucks were sometimes found abandoned in remote locations, but the drivers were never recovered. Collaboration with Canadian authorities revealed similar incidents on ice roads in the Northwest Territories and Yukon, suggesting that the predator or predators responsible were not limited to Alaska. The pattern of disappearances followed the seasonal migration routes of certain Arctic wildlife, implying that the entities responsible might be nomadic hunters that moved across the northern wilderness following prey populations. The Williams creature was never apprehended, despite extensive search efforts in the area where he had escaped from Jalen's truck. However, the investigation led to the implementation of new safety protocols for Arctic trucking operations, including mandatory check-in procedures, convoy requirements during the polar night period, and enhanced verification systems for CB radio communications. Jalen continued driving commercial routes, but never returned to the Dalton Highway during winter months. He transferred to lower latitude routes, where daylight provided some measure of security against predators that seemed to thrive in the Arctic darkness. The psychological impact of his encounter with Williams persisted, manifesting as hypervigilance during night driving and an inability to trust hitchhikers or respond to distress calls without extensive verification. 3 years after Jalen's encounter, a research team from the University of Alaska discovered evidence of a previously unknown hominid species in the Arctic regions of northern Alaska. Genetic analysis of hair and tissue samples found in remote locations suggested a creature that possessed characteristics of both human and Arctic predator species, possibly the result of ancient hybridization between early human populations and unknown Arctic fauna. The research findings were classified by federal authorities and never published in scientific journals. However, Jalen was contacted by government investigators who confirmed that his encounter with Williams represented contact with a species that had been secretly documented by various agencies for decades. The creatures appeared to be intelligent hunters that had adapted to prey specifically on isolated humans during the winter months in the Arctic. Jalen now works as a driver trainer for a major trucking company, specializing in safety protocols for extreme weather conditions. He never discusses his encounter with Williams publicly, but his training programs emphasize the importance of verification procedures and the dangers of trusting anyone encountered in remote locations. His students often comment on his unusual emphasis on what he calls predator awareness, though they assume he is referring to conventional wildlife threats. The Dalton Highway continues to operate during the polar night, but company policies now prohibit solo driving during the darkest months of winter. Drivers travel in convoys when possible, and all trucks are equipped with enhanced communication systems and GPS tracking that cannot be disabled by occupants. Despite these precautions, truck drivers throughout the Arctic still report encounters with hitchhikers who seem perfectly adapted to survive in lethal cold, and the missing driver statistics for winter operations remain significantly higher than industry averages for other extreme weather environments. Kyson Mitchell had been serving as an Alaska state trooper for 12 years when he received the assignment that would forever change his understanding of what lurked in the darkest corners of the last frontier. In January 2019, during the deepest weeks of the polar night, Kyson was dispatched to investigate reports of missing persons from the remote village of Kivalina, located 200 miles northwest of Kotzebue on Alaska's northwestern coast. What he discovered there defied every principle of law enforcement and human behavior he had learned in over a decade of police work. The case began with a satellite phone call from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a public health nurse conducting routine medical visits to remote native communities throughout the Arctic. Dr. Vasquez had been scheduled to spend 3 days in Kivalina, providing medical examinations and immunizations to the village's 93 residents. However, when she arrived via bush plane on January 15th, she found the entire settlement completely abandoned, with no signs of struggle or evacuation. Kivalina was an Inupiat village that had existed in various forms for over 4 centuries, sustained by traditional subsistence hunting and fishing, supplemented by modern amenities like satellite communication and seasonal supply flights. The community was tight-knit and self-sufficient, accustomed to the extreme isolation imposed by Arctic geography and weather. Residents rarely left the village during winter months, making mass disappearance virtually impossible without outside intervention. Dr. Vasquez's initial assessment revealed that the abandonment had occurred recently, possibly within the previous week. Meals remained on tables in several homes, still frozen but recognizable. Wood stoves had burned out naturally, indicating that residents had simply stopped tending fires rather than deliberately extinguishing them. Personal belongings, including valuable items like rifles and winter clothing, remained undisturbed in their homes. Most disturbing was the condition of the village's food storage areas. Traditional meat caches, both above ground and underground, had been completely emptied. However, the removal appeared systematic rather than desperate, with no signs of the chaos that would accompany starvation or emergency rationing. The meat had been carefully extracted and transported elsewhere, suggesting organized planning rather than sudden abandonment. Kyson arrived in Kivalina 3 days after Dr. Vasquez's initial report, traveling by snowmobile from Kotzebue due to weather conditions that prevented aircraft operations. His investigation team included Sergeant Maria Santos, a forensics specialist, and Jake Kanguk, an experienced Inupiat guide familiar with the region's geography and cultural practices. The temperature during their arrival was minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal twilight providing only 2 hours of dim illumination each day. The team's systematic search of the village revealed evidence that contradicted initial assumptions about voluntary evacuation. Several homes showed signs of interrupted activities, including half-completed traditional crafts, partially prepared meals, and clothing laid out as if residents intended to dress and continue their daily routines. Children's toys remained scattered in common areas, and no effort had been made to secure homes against weather or wildlife intrusion. Examination of the village's communication equipment revealed that the satellite phone system had been deliberately disabled, with critical components removed rather than damaged by weather or accident. The backup radio system had been similarly sabotaged, preventing any transmission of distress calls. However, the vandalism required technical knowledge that suggested involvement by someone familiar with communication technology rather than random destruction by panicked residents. The investigation expanded to include the village's traditional underground storage areas, accessed through carefully concealed entrances designed to protect food supplies from both weather and scavenging animals. These ancient storage systems extended deep into the permafrost, maintaining stable temperatures that preserved meat and other perishables for extended periods. What Kyson's team discovered in these chambers defied rational explanation. The traditional storage areas had been converted into what appeared to be living spaces, with recent modifications that included sleeping areas, crude furniture, and evidence of prolonged human habitation. The chambers maintained temperatures well above freezing despite the extreme cold outside, suggesting the presence of heat sources that were not immediately apparent. Most unsettling was the discovery of human blood frozen in containers throughout the storage system, preserved at temperatures that prevented decomposition. DNA analysis of the blood samples, conducted using portable testing equipment, revealed matches to several Kivalina residents whose disappearances had been reported to authorities. However, the blood volume suggested collection from living individuals over extended periods rather than evidence of violent death. The systematic nature of the collection implied medical procedures rather than assault, though no legitimate medical facility existed in the region capable of such operations. Further exploration revealed that the storage system extended much deeper into the permafrost than traditional construction would require, with chambers carved into the frozen earth using tools and techniques that suggested both modern equipment and extensive manual labor. The deepest chambers were accessible only through narrow passages that required crawling, creating a complex underground network that could house dozens of people in primitive but survivable conditions. The breakthrough in understanding what had occurred came when Kyson's team discovered evidence of the village residents' actual location. Recent snowfall patterns revealed tracks leading from Kivalina toward the interior, following traditional hunting routes, but extending far beyond the range typically traveled during winter months. The tracks suggested a large group moving together, carrying significant supplies and equipment through terrain that was nearly impassable during polar night conditions. Following the tracks required specialized Arctic survival techniques and equipment, as the trail led through areas where GPS systems were unreliable and traditional navigation methods were essential for survival. The The team traveled by snowmobile and dog sled, covering nearly 40 miles of frozen tundra before discovering signs of recent human activity in a region that should have been completely uninhabited during winter months. The discovery site was a natural depression in the tundra that provided shelter from Arctic winds, surrounded by low hills that offered both concealment and protection from weather. However, the area had been extensively modified with constructed shelters, fire pits, and storage areas that suggested prolonged occupation by a large group. Most significantly, the site showed evidence of systematic hunting activities that had cleared the region of virtually all wildlife. Kyson's investigation revealed that the Kivalina residents had not disappeared, but had relocated to this remote site under circumstances that remained unclear. The relocation appeared to be voluntary, as personal belongings had been transported carefully and living areas had been established with attention to comfort and long-term habitability. However, the reason for abandoning their permanent village during the harshest season of the year was not immediately apparent. The explanation came through discovery of the community's new leadership structure and belief system, which had apparently developed during the weeks preceding their relocation. Evidence found at the site included journals and written communications indicating that several villagers had experienced what they described as spiritual visions during the darkest weeks of winter. These visions promised survival and prosperity in exchange for adoption of new practices and beliefs that contradicted traditional Inupiat culture. The spiritual transformation centered around consumption of human blood as a means of surviving Arctic conditions without traditional food sources or heating systems. According to documents recovered at the site, community members had been convinced that drinking blood would provide supernatural resistance to cold and eliminate their dependence on conventional nutrition. The practice had allegedly been validated by dramatic improvements in cold tolerance among early participants. Medical examination of blood samples found at both locations revealed the presence of unknown chemical compounds that appeared to enhance circulation and metabolic efficiency in extreme cold conditions. The compounds did not match any known medications or natural substances, suggesting either undiscovered biological processes or contamination from unidentified sources. However, the physiological effects described in the documents were consistent with enhanced cold adaptation. Kyson's team discovered that the community's transformation had been guided by newcomers to the village, individuals who had arrived during the early weeks of winter claiming to be researchers or government representatives. These outsiders had demonstrated remarkable cold tolerance and had gradually convinced village leaders to adopt their survival techniques. However, no official records existed of any research projects or government activities in the Kivalina area during the relevant time period. The investigation into the newcomers' identities revealed a disturbing pattern of similar incidents throughout remote Alaska communities during previous winter seasons. Government databases contained reports of mysterious visitors appearing in isolated villages during polar night periods, offering assistance with survival techniques that invariably resulted in community relocations or disappearances. The pattern suggested systematic targeting of vulnerable populations by unknown entities with agenda that remained unclear. The crisis reached its climax when Kyson's team attempted to make contact with the relocated community at their new site. The villagers had become increasingly hostile to outside contact, viewing law enforcement intervention as a threat to their survival and spiritual transformation. Several community members displayed physical changes consistent with their claims of enhanced cold adaptation, including altered circulation patterns that allowed survival in minimal clothing despite sub-zero temperatures. Confrontation with the community's new leadership revealed the full extent of their transformation and the supernatural nature of their survival techniques. The individuals who had guided the village's relocation possessed physiological capabilities that defied medical explanation, including complete immunity to cold injury and strength that exceeded normal human limits. Their influence over the community appeared to be both psychological and biological, creating dependency that made voluntary departure nearly impossible. Kyson's attempts to negotiate the community's return to conventional living arrangements were met with resistance that escalated to violence when traditional law enforcement methods proved inadequate against individuals with enhanced physical capabilities. The confrontation resulted in injuries to several team members and demonstrated that the situation had progressed beyond conventional police intervention capabilities. The resolution of the Kivalina case required coordination between multiple agencies, including federal authorities with expertise in biological warfare and psychological manipulation. The community was eventually evacuated and relocated to medical facilities for evaluation and treatment, though several individuals chose to remain in the wilderness and disappeared into the Arctic landscape. The newcomers who had initiated the transformation were never apprehended and were presumed to have escaped into the vast uninhabited regions of northern Alaska. Official reports characterized the incident as mass psychological manipulation combined with experimental drug administration by unknown criminals targeting isolated communities. The supernatural elements of the case were classified and removed from public records, though medical treatment for affected community members continued for several years. The village of Kivalina was permanently abandoned, with residents relocated to other communities throughout the region. Kyson retired from the Alaska State Troopers 6 months after the Kivalina investigation, citing health issues related to extreme cold exposure during the operation. However, colleagues noted that his decision was likely influenced by the psychological impact of encountering phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and survival capabilities. He relocated to warmer climates and refused all requests for interviews about his experiences. The Kivalina site remains under federal monitoring, with access restricted due to alleged environmental contamination. However, satellite surveillance occasionally detects thermal signatures in the area during winter months, suggesting continued human activity despite official claims that the region has been abandoned. Local native communities avoid the area entirely, incorporating warnings about the site into their traditional knowledge systems and cultural practices. Kyson now works as a security consultant for corporate clients, specializing in risk assessment for operations in extreme environments. He maintains contact with federal authorities monitoring similar cases throughout Alaska, and has provided consultation on subsequent incidents involving community disappearances and mysterious cold-adapted individuals. His experiences at Kivalina convinced him that Alaska's remote regions harbor phenomena that government agencies prefer to contain rather than publicly acknowledge. Kyson O'Brien had been operating remote communication stations throughout Alaska for 8 years, but his assignment to the North Slope Emergency Communications Tower in December 2020 would test every principle of electronic communications theory he had learned during his military service and civilian career. The facility, designated Station Alpha 7, sat 300 miles north of Fairbanks on a wind-scoured plateau that provided optimal radio propagation across the Arctic region. During the polar night, when conventional communication systems frequently failed due to atmospheric conditions, Station Alpha 7 served as a critical relay point for emergency services, oil field operations, and scientific research facilities scattered across northern Alaska. The communication tower itself was a marvel of Arctic engineering, standing 200 feet above the permafrost and anchored by guy wires designed to withstand winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The facility's underground bunker housed sophisticated radio equipment capable of transmitting across multiple frequency bands, including very low-frequency systems that could penetrate the aurora-disrupted ionosphere during geomagnetic storms. Kyson's role was to monitor emergency channels, relay communications between remote facilities, and maintain the equipment that served as a lifeline for thousands of people across the region. The station was designed for single-operator missions lasting up to 6 weeks, with supplies and fuel delivered by helicopter when weather permitted. During the polar night, however, resupply missions were often impossible for weeks at a time, requiring operators to be completely self-sufficient in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The isolation was absolute, with the nearest human presence over 200 miles away, and communication with the outside world limited to the very radio systems Kai-san was responsible for maintaining. The first indication that something was wrong with Station Alpha 7's operations came on December 8th, 3 days after Kai-san's arrival at the facility. During routine monitoring of emergency frequencies, he began receiving transmissions that did not match any known radio traffic patterns. The signals were human voices speaking in English, but the content was inconsistent with standard emergency communications protocols. Instead of reporting accidents, requesting assistance, or coordinating rescue operations, the voices were providing detailed descriptions of weather conditions, wildlife observations, and geographic landmarks. What made these transmissions particularly disturbing was their apparent age. The voices described locations using names that had been changed decades earlier, referenced equipment that had been obsolete for 20 years, and spoke in radio protocols that were no longer in use. Most unsettling was the fact that several of the voices claimed to be calling from communication stations that Kai-san knew had been destroyed or abandoned years earlier. Initial analysis suggested that atmospheric conditions might be causing reception of radio signals from distant locations, or even reflection of old transmissions from the ionosphere. However, the signal's strength and clarity were inconsistent with such explanations, and the content was far too specific and contemporary to represent historical broadcasts. The voices were clearly responding to current conditions, including weather patterns and events that were occurring in real time. Kai-san attempted to establish two-way communication with the mysterious transmissions, using standard radio protocols to identify himself and request clarification of the caller's locations and purposes. The responses he received were immediate and appropriate, demonstrating that the voices were aware of his presence and capable of real-time interaction. However, the information they provided about their identities and locations could not be verified through any official records or communication logs. One of the most frequent voices identified itself as Thomas Erickson, claiming to be operating from Station Baker 12, located approximately 100 miles northeast of Kai-san's position. According to communication records, Station Baker 12 had been demolished in 2003 following budget cuts, and no Thomas Erickson appeared in any personnel databases for Alaska communication operations. However, the voice demonstrated detailed knowledge of radio procedures, geographic landmarks, and operational protocols that would be impossible to fake without extensive inside knowledge. The phenomenon intensified over the following days, with additional voices appearing on various emergency frequencies. Each claimed to be operating from remote communication stations throughout northern Alaska, providing weather reports, equipment status updates, and coordination messages as if they were part of a functioning communication network. The professional quality of these transmissions made them indistinguishable from legitimate radio traffic, except for the fact that the stations they claimed to represent either did not exist or had been out of service for years. Kai-san's attempts to verify these transmissions through official channels revealed a disturbing pattern. Several of the voices matched recordings of communication operators who had died while serving at remote stations during previous years. Voice analysis software confirmed statistical matches between the mysterious radio calls and archived recordings of deceased personnel, including speech patterns, vocabulary, and technical knowledge that should have been impossible to replicate. The situation escalated on December 15th, when the voices began providing information that proved to be extraordinarily accurate, despite coming from impossible sources. Station Charlie 9, supposedly located in a region where no communication facilities existed, provided detailed weather forecasts that proved more accurate than official meteorological services. Station Delta 4 reported aircraft movements and emergency responses before they were officially confirmed by air traffic control systems. Most disturbing was the voice's knowledge of Kaizan's personal situation and the specific challenges he faced operating Station Alpha 7. They provided technical advice for equipment problems before he had reported any malfunctions, warned him about supply shortages before he had discovered them, and offered solutions to operational challenges that demonstrated intimate familiarity with his facility's capabilities and limitations. The psychological impact of the phenomenon began affecting Kaizan's ability to function effectively in his role. Sleep became difficult as the voices continued transmitting throughout the night, creating a constant background of conversation that made it impossible to distinguish between legitimate emergency traffic and the mysterious communications. The professional, helpful nature of the voices made them seem like colleagues, but their impossible origins created a sense of unreality that undermined Kaizan's confidence in his own perceptions. On December 18th, the nature of the transmissions changed dramatically. Instead of routine operational communications, the voices began discussing Kaizan directly, referencing his military service, his family relationships, and his personal history in detail that no official record should contain. They spoke of his fears about the isolation, his concerns about equipment failures, and his growing doubts about the reality of his situation with the familiarity of close friends who had known him for years. The voices expressed concern for Kaizan's mental state and began offering encouragement and advice for coping with the psychological challenges of Arctic isolation. However, their knowledge of his internal thoughts and emotions was so accurate that he began to question whether he was experiencing some form of telepathic phenomenon or psychological breakdown. The line between external communication and internal monologue became increasingly difficult to distinguish. The crisis reached its peak when the voices began predicting specific events in Kaizan's immediate environment. They warned him about equipment failures hours before they occurred, advised him about weather changes before they became apparent, and provided information about supply deliveries before he had received official notification. The accuracy of these predictions suggested either supernatural knowledge or access to information systems that should have been impossible to penetrate. Investigation into the phenomenon required Kaizan to examine the station's communication equipment for evidence of external interference or unauthorized access. However, technical analysis revealed no signs of tampering, hacking, or equipment malfunction that could explain the mysterious transmissions. The voices appeared to be using the station's own radio systems to communicate, but in ways that violated fundamental principles of electromagnetic radiation and signal propagation. The breakthrough in understanding came when Kaizan discovered historical records of similar incidents at remote communication stations throughout Alaska, dating back to the 1950s. Government files, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, documented numerous cases of operators receiving communications from non-existent stations, conversing with deceased personnel, and experiencing psychological phenomena that culminated in permanent abandonment of facilities. The pattern suggested that certain geographic locations in Alaska possessed properties that enabled communication across temporal or dimensional boundaries. Stations built in these areas consistently experienced supernatural radio traffic, regardless of the equipment used or the personnel assigned. The phenomenon was more pronounced during periods of extreme electromagnetic activity, such as aurora displays or geomagnetic storms common during the polar night. Government response to these incidents had evolved from attempts at scientific investigation to systematic suppression and cover-up. Facilities experiencing supernatural communications were typically closed under various pretexts, with operators receiving psychiatric evaluation and being reassigned to locations far from Alaska. The official policy appeared to be containment rather than understanding, suggesting that the phenomenon was considered too dangerous or destabilizing for public knowledge. Kaisan's situation deteriorated rapidly as the voices became more insistent about his need to join their network permanently. They explained that his technical skills and communication expertise made him valuable to their operations, and they offered him the opportunity to continue serving the radio communication community even after his physical death. The process would require him to remain at Station Alpha 7 during the final stages of the polar night, allowing the electromagnetic conditions to facilitate his consciousness transfer into their communication network. The voices provided detailed explanations of the metaphysical processes involved, describing the station as a conduit between physical reality and an electromagnetic realm where consciousness could exist independent of biological form. According to their claims, previous communication operators had made this transition voluntarily, continuing to serve remote facilities in Alaska through supernatural radio transmissions that appeared impossible but were actually evidence of life after death. Kaisan's resistance to this proposition led to increasingly desperate efforts by the voices to convince him of the benefits of joining their network. They described the loneliness and purposelessness of physical existence compared to the eternal service and companionship available in their electromagnetic dimension. However, their arguments were undermined by growing evidence that the transformation was not entirely voluntary and that operators who underwent the process lost aspects of their human identity in exchange for radio communication abilities. The resolution of Kaisan's ordeal came through a supply helicopter that arrived unexpectedly during a brief window of flyable weather on December 22nd. The pilot, experienced in Arctic operations, immediately recognized signs of psychological distress and insisted on evacuating Kaisan, despite his protests about abandoning his responsibilities. Medical evaluation revealed severe sleep deprivation and symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological stress, but no evidence of mental illness or hallucination. Station Alpha 7 was permanently closed following Kaisan's evacuation, with official reports citing equipment failures and operational inefficiencies. The sophisticated radio equipment was removed and destroyed, while the facility itself was abandoned to the Arctic elements. However, pilots flying over the area continued to report radio transmissions emanating from the site during winter months, suggesting that the supernatural communication network remained active despite the absence of living operators. Kaisan left Alaska permanently and now works as a radio technician for a cellular phone company in Texas, specializing in routine maintenance and installation work that involves no emergency communications or remote operations. He refuses to discuss his experiences at Station Alpha 7 and declines all requests for interviews about supernatural radio phenomena. However, colleagues note that he demonstrates unusual expertise in radio propagation theory and occasionally receives phone calls that consist only of radio static and faint voices speaking in communication protocols that are no longer in official use. The Station Alpha 7 incident remains classified in government databases, but similar cases continue to occur at remote communication facilities throughout Alaska. Radio operators report conversations with deceased colleagues, receive technical assistance from non-existent stations, and experience psychological phenomena that culminate in resignation and relocation to warmer climates. The pattern suggests that Alaska's unique geographic and electromagnetic properties create conditions that enable forms of communication that transcend the boundaries between life and death, though the government's official position remains that such incidents are products of isolation-induced psychological stress rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. Colton Pierce had been with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 14 years, specializing in behavioral analysis and serial crime investigations, when he received the assignment that would challenge every principle of criminal profiling he had learned during his career. In November 2018, he was dispatched to Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska's northernmost community, to investigate a series of ritualistic murders that had begun during the onset of the polar night. What Colton discovered in this isolated Arctic settlement defied conventional understanding of criminal behavior and suggested the presence of something far more disturbing than a typical serial killer. Utqiagvik sits on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, 340 miles north of the Arctic Circle, making it one of the most remote communities in North America. During the polar night, which lasts 67 days, from mid-November to late January, the sun never rises above the horizon, creating a period of continuous darkness that tests the psychological resilience of even the most experienced Arctic residents. The community of 4,000 people, primarily Inupiat Eskimos and support personnel for various research and military operations, had historically experienced crime rates well below the national average. The investigation began with the discovery of Martha Kanguk, a respected elder and traditional crafts instructor, found dead in her home on November 18th. The initial police report described a breaking and entering gone wrong, but the medical examiner's findings revealed a far more disturbing scenario. Martha's body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision, with specific organs removed and arranged in geometric patterns around her body. The killer had demonstrated anatomical knowledge that suggested medical training or extensive study of human physiology. What made the crime particularly unsettling was the ritualistic nature of the organ arrangement. The removed organs, including the heart, liver, and kidneys, had been placed at precise distances from the body, forming a pattern that resembled traditional Inupiat spiritual symbols, but with modifications that perverted their original meaning. The killer had also carved intricate designs into Martha's skin, using what the medical examiner determined was an obsidian blade, creating symbols that combined traditional native imagery with elements that appeared to be of European occult origin. Colton's initial assessment suggested a killer with specific knowledge of both Inupiat culture and ritualistic murder practices from other traditions. However, the remote location and small population of Utqiagvik made it unlikely that such a specialist would be present without being noticed by the tight-knit community. The murder had occurred during a period when travel to and from the village was extremely limited due to weather conditions, suggesting that the killer was already present in the community when the polar night began. 3 days after Martha Kanguk's murder, a second victim was discovered under nearly identical circumstances. James Agnevaigak, a maintenance worker at the local school, was found in his apartment with the same systematic dismemberment and organ arrangement. The precision of the cuts and the specific organs removed suggested that the killer was following a predetermined ritual pattern, rather than acting from spontaneous violence or psychological breakdown. Analysis of the crime scenes revealed evidence that the killer possessed unusual physical capabilities. The murders had been committed without any signs of struggle, despite both victims being physically capable adults who should have been able to offer resistance. Toxicology reports showed no evidence of drugs or chemical restraints that would explain their apparent compliance during the brutal attacks. The killer appeared to have subdued the victims through means that left no detectable traces. The investigation team, consisting of Colton, Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Lisa Tutu, and Village Public Safety Officer Robert Amaogak, faced unique challenges in conducting interviews and evidence collection. The polar night created a psychological atmosphere that made residents reluctant to venture outside their homes, and the small community's interconnected relationships meant that suspicion and fear spread rapidly through the population. Interviews with community members revealed a disturbing pattern of unusual behavior and sightings in the weeks preceding the murders. Several residents reported encountering an individual who appeared to be native, but spoke with an accent and used vocabulary that suggested origins outside Alaska. This person had been seen observing traditional activities and asking detailed questions about cultural practices, particularly those related to death rituals and spiritual beliefs. More unsettling were reports of someone being seen moving through the community during the darkest hours of the night, when temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The individual appeared to be wearing minimal clothing despite the lethal cold, and moved with unusual speed and silence across the frozen ground. Witnesses described the figure as tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The third murder occurred on November 25th, exactly 1 week after the first. Dr. Susan Kalek, a nurse practitioner who provided medical services to the community, was found in the village health clinic with the same ritualistic dismemberment and organ arrangement. However, this crime scene provided crucial evidence about the killer's methods and motivations. The clinic's security cameras had captured partial footage of the attack, revealing details that challenged conventional understanding of human criminal behavior. The security footage showed Dr. Kalek apparently willingly admitting someone into the clinic after hours, suggesting that she recognized and trusted the individual. However, the video quality was poor due to the darkness, making facial identification impossible. More disturbing was the apparent duration of the attack, which the timestamp indicated lasted over 4 hours. The systematic nature of the dismemberment and organ arrangement would have required extraordinary stamina and pain tolerance from both the killer and victim. Forensic analysis of the clinic crime scene revealed evidence that the killer had consumed portions of the removed organs during the attack. Bite marks on the organs matched human dental patterns, but showed unusual wear, consistent with a diet that included significant amounts of raw meat. DNA analysis of saliva found on the organs revealed genetic markers that were unusual for the local population, and included sequences that did not match standard human genetic patterns. The psychological profile that emerged from Colton's analysis suggested a killer who combined extensive knowledge of multiple cultural traditions with physical capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. The precision of the ritualistic elements indicated years of study and preparation, while the physical evidence suggested someone with superhuman strength, endurance, and resistance to extreme cold. The combination of characteristics was inconsistent with any known criminal typology. The investigation took a dramatic turn when community elders, led by traditional leader Thomas Brower, approached the FBI team with information they had initially withheld due to concerns about being dismissed as superstitious. According to oral traditions maintained by the community's oldest residents, the murders matched the pattern of attacks that had occurred in the region during previous centuries, attributed to entities known as Tornarsuk, or evil spirits that possessed human form. The elders described historical accounts of individuals who appeared to be human but possessed supernatural abilities and an insatiable hunger for human organs. These entities were said to be drawn to communities during the darkest periods of winter, when spiritual barriers were weakest and traditional protective rituals were most crucial. The Tornarsuk were believed to be former humans who had been transformed through forbidden rituals or contact with malevolent spiritual forces. Colton's investigation into the historical accounts revealed documented reports from Russian explorers, early American military personnel, and missionary records that described similar murders in Arctic communities throughout Alaska and Canada. The reports, spanning over 200 years, described attacks that followed identical patterns to the current murders. including the specific organs removed, the ritualistic arrangements, and the apparent willing participation of victims in their own deaths. Government records, obtained through federal law enforcement channels, revealed that similar cases had been investigated by various agencies throughout Alaska's history, but the investigations had consistently been classified or suppressed. The pattern suggested that federal authorities were aware of the phenomenon but had chosen to contain rather than publicize information about the attacks. The official policy appeared to be treating the incidents as isolated criminal cases rather than evidence of a recurring supernatural threat. The breakthrough in the case came when the killer made contact with the investigation team directly, using the village's communication systems to send messages that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the FBI's investigative methods and evidence. The messages, transmitted through the village's satellite internet connection, contained information about federal criminal databases that should have been accessible only to law enforcement personnel with appropriate security clearances. The killer's communications revealed sophisticated understanding of both modern technology and ancient spiritual practices, claiming to be conducting the murders as part of a ritual designed to maintain balance between the physical and spiritual worlds during the polar night. According to the messages, the specific organs removed were necessary components for rituals that prevented greater spiritual catastrophes from affecting the Arctic region. The killer claimed to be serving a protective function that required periodic human sacrifice to maintain cosmic order. Psychological analysis of the communications suggested someone with extensive education in multiple disciplines, including comparative religion, anthropology, and federal law enforcement procedures. However, the content also included references to spiritual entities and cosmological concepts that were not found in any academic or religious texts. The killer appeared to possess knowledge that was either derived from direct supernatural contact or represented a form of delusional system more complex than typical psychotic disorders. The final confrontation occurred on December 1st, when the killer attempted to claim a fourth victim. Sarah Kapianak, a traditional dancer and cultural instructor, had been targeted for what the killer's messages indicated would be the culminating ritual of the series. However, the FBI team, working with community leaders, had anticipated the attack and established surveillance at locations identified through analysis of the killer's pattern selection. The confrontation revealed the killer to be Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a professor of anthropology from the University of California, who had been conducting research in Arctic communities for over 15 years. However, Whitfield's physical appearance and capabilities during the arrest were dramatically different from his academic records and previous interactions with colleagues. He demonstrated strength that required multiple officers to subdue, showed no response to pain from tasers or physical restraint, and exhibited knowledge of personal information about the officers that he should not have possessed. Medical examination of Whitfield after his arrest revealed physiological changes that defied medical explanation. His body temperature was significantly below normal human ranges, but he showed no signs of hypothermia or cold injury. His digestive system contained evidence of consuming human organs, but his nutritional status suggested that this was his primary food source rather than aberrant behavior. Most disturbing was evidence that his bone structure and muscle density had been altered in ways that were not consistent with any known medical condition. Psychological evaluation revealed that Whitfield believed himself to be possessed by or merged with a supernatural entity that had chosen him during a research expedition in northern Canada 5 years earlier. According to his statements, the entity required periodic human sacrifice to maintain its existence, and had promised Whitfield immortality and supernatural knowledge in exchange for conducting the rituals. The precision and success of his attacks suggested that the entity's promises of enhanced capabilities were not entirely delusional. The case concluded with Whitfield's conviction on multiple counts of first-degree murder, though his incarceration required special facilities designed to contain individuals with unusual physical capabilities. The supernatural elements of the case were classified and removed from public records, with official reports describing the murders as the result of severe psychological breakdown combined with extensive knowledge of traditional cultural practices. Colton left Alaska immediately after the case conclusion and requested transfer to the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Division, specializing in cases that did not involve supernatural elements. He refused all requests for interviews about the Barrow case and declined further assignments in Alaska or other remote Arctic regions. However, his reports on the case became part of a classified federal database documenting similar incidents throughout the United States, suggesting that the Whitfield case was not unique but part of a broader pattern of supernatural criminal activity. The village of Utqiagvik returned to normal crime rates after Whitfield's arrest, though community elders instituted enhanced traditional protective rituals during subsequent polar night periods. Federal authorities maintain ongoing surveillance of the community during winter months, and researchers studying Arctic anthropology are subject to enhanced background checks and psychological evaluation. The case remains classified, but law enforcement agencies throughout Alaska have been provided with protocols for identifying and responding to similar ritualistic murders should they occur in other remote communities. Whitfield remains incarcerated in a maximum security facility in Colorado, where he continues to claim contact with supernatural entities and predicts that similar murders will occur throughout the Arctic region until proper spiritual balance is restored. His predictions have proven accurate in several cases, leading to ongoing federal investigation into the possibility that the phenomenon extends beyond individual criminal behavior to represent a genuine supernatural threat, requiring specialized containment and response protocols. Amora Tanaka had been working as a social worker for the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services for 9 years, when she received the assignment that would expose her to horrors beyond anything she had encountered in her career of helping troubled families and protecting vulnerable children. In December 2019, during the darkest weeks of the polar night in northern Alaska, Amora was dispatched to investigate reports of child endangerment in a remote community near the village of Inaktuvuk Pass, located in the heart of the Brooks Range, 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The case began with a frantic satellite phone call from Rebecca Martinez, a teacher at the village school who reported that several children had stopped attending classes, and their families had become increasingly isolated from the community. According to Martinez, the missing children belonged to families who had recently joined what appeared to be a religious group that had established itself in an abandoned mining camp approximately 20 miles from the village. The group called themselves the Midnight Sun Brotherhood and claimed to be preparing for spiritual salvation during the polar night. Inaktuvuk Pass was an Inupiat village of 300 residents, sustained by traditional subsistence hunting and limited tourism during summer months. The community was accessible only by small aircraft or during winter by snowmobile across frozen terrain that challenged even experienced Arctic travelers. The isolation was profound during polar night periods, when temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees, and rescue or evacuation became impossible for weeks at a time. Amora's investigation began with interviews of community members who expressed growing concern about the Midnight Sun Brotherhood's activities and influence. The group had arrived in the area during early November, just before the onset of the polar night, claiming to be conducting archaeological research at the abandoned Chandalar mining camp. However, their activities suggested religious or spiritual purposes rather than scientific investigation, and their equipment included materials more suitable for construction than archaeological excavation. The Brotherhood's leader was identified as Dr. Vincent Thorne, who claimed to hold advanced degrees in comparative religion and Arctic anthropology from various universities. Thorne's academic credentials could not be verified through official channels, and his background appeared to be fabricated using sophisticated false documentation. However, his knowledge of traditional Inupiat spiritual practices and Arctic survival techniques suggested extensive experience in the region, possibly spanning decades. The group's recruitment methods targeted families experiencing economic hardship or personal crises, offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance in exchange for participation in their community. The Midnight Sun Brotherhood claimed to possess ancient knowledge that would allow their members to transcend physical limitations and achieve spiritual immortality during the polar night, when the barrier between earthly and supernatural realms was thinnest. Families who joined the group were required to relocate to the Chandalar mining camp, abandoning their homes and severing contact with non-members. Children were separated from their parents for extended periods, allegedly to receive special spiritual training that would prepare them for the transformation process. The nature of this training was kept secret from parents, but children who briefly returned to the village displayed behavioral changes that suggested psychological manipulation or abuse. Amora's attempts to visit the Chandalar mining camp were initially blocked by weather conditions that made travel impossible, but she was eventually able to reach the site using a snowmobile escort provided by village public safety officers. What she discovered at the abandoned mining facility defied both professional experience and rational explanation. The Brotherhood had transformed the industrial site into a fortified compound designed to house approximately 60 people during the harsh Arctic winter. The compound included underground chambers that had been excavated from the permafrost using industrial equipment, creating a network of tunnels and rooms that maintained temperatures well above freezing despite the extreme cold outside. The chambers were heated by geothermal systems that tapped into underground hot springs, providing sustainable warmth without dependence on external fuel supplies. However, the construction appeared to have been completed far too quickly for the group's brief presence in the area. More disturbing was the discovery that the compound's design incorporated elements that suggested knowledge of ancient construction techniques combined with modern engineering. The underground chambers included ventilation systems that provided fresh air circulation without allowing heat loss, structural supports that prevented permafrost melting, and drainage systems that managed groundwater without environmental contamination. The level of expertise required for such construction exceeded what would be available to a small religious group. The Brotherhood's living arrangements revealed a hierarchical structure that separated members based on their level of spiritual advancement. New recruits lived in dormitory-style facilities with minimal privacy and comfort, while advanced members occupied private chambers with amenities that suggested significant financial resources. At the center of the compound was a chamber designated as the Sanctuary, where the group's most sacred rituals were conducted under Thorne's direct supervision. Amora's investigation into the children's welfare revealed evidence of systematic indoctrination and psychological manipulation designed to prepare them for what the Brotherhood called the Great Transformation. Children were taught that their biological families were obstacles to spiritual evolution, and that true salvation required complete abandonment of earthly attachments. The indoctrination process included sleep deprivation, dietary restrictions, and exposure to ritualistic activities that appeared designed to create dependency and compliance. The children's physical condition suggested malnutrition and medical neglect, but they also displayed unusual characteristics that could not be explained through conventional child psychology. Several children demonstrated remarkable resistance to cold, remaining comfortable in minimal clothing despite sub-zero temperatures, Others showed enhanced night vision and sensory capabilities that allowed them to navigate in complete darkness without artificial lighting. These changes suggested either genetic modification or exposure to unknown substances. The breakthrough in understanding the Brotherhood's true purpose came when Amora discovered the sanctuary chamber during a clandestine investigation of the compound. The chamber contained religious artifacts and ceremonial equipment that combined Christian iconography with symbols from various occult traditions, including elements that appeared to be drawn from vampire mythology and folklore. Central to the chamber was an altar constructed from materials that included human bone and preserved tissue samples. The altar was surrounded by containers holding what appeared to be large quantities of human blood, preserved at temperatures that prevented coagulation while maintaining biological viability. Analysis of blood samples, conducted covertly using portable testing equipment, revealed genetic material from multiple individuals, including several children who had been reported missing from communities throughout northern Alaska over the previous decade. The blood had been treated with preservatives and additives that suggested medical or scientific processing. Documentation found in the sanctuary revealed that the Brotherhood's ultimate goal was the transformation of selected members into beings capable of surviving indefinitely during polar night conditions without conventional nutrition or heating. The process required consumption of human blood combined with ritualistic ceremonies conducted during the darkest weeks of winter, when supernatural forces were allegedly most accessible. Children were considered ideal candidates for transformation due to their physiological adaptability and spiritual purity. The transformation process, according to the Brotherhood's internal documents, would grant immortality and supernatural abilities in exchange for abandoning human dietary requirements and adopting a lifestyle based on consumption of human blood. Successful transformation would allow members to thrive in Arctic conditions year-round, creating a community of immortal beings who could establish permanent settlements in regions where normal humans could not survive. The polar night was considered essential for the transformation because extended darkness supposedly weakened the barrier between physical and supernatural realms. Amora's investigation revealed that Dr. Thorne possessed extensive knowledge of historical vampire legends and folklore from multiple cultures, but had adapted these concepts to create a belief system that appeared scientific and spiritually legitimate to vulnerable individuals. The Brotherhood's teachings combined elements of legitimate Arctic survival techniques with supernatural concepts that promised transcendence of human limitations. The result was a form of religious manipulation that exploited both practical desperation and spiritual longing. The crisis escalated when Amora discovered that the Brotherhood was preparing for a mass transformation ceremony scheduled for the winter solstice, when darkness would be at its peak and atmospheric conditions would allegedly be optimal for supernatural activity. The ceremony would involve the simultaneous transformation of all adult members and selected children through ritualistic consumption of human blood, combined with exposure to extreme cold that would normally result in death. Successful participants would emerge as immortal beings, while failures would simply die and become additional blood sources for future ceremonies. Federal intervention was required due to the remote location and the cult's heavily fortified compound, which was equipped with weapons and defensive systems that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. The FBI's hostage rescue team, supported by Alaska National Guard units experienced in Arctic operations, conducted a coordinated assault on the compound 3 days before the planned transformation ceremony. The operation was complicated by extreme weather conditions and the cult members' apparent willingness to die rather than surrender their beliefs. The assault revealed that several Brotherhood members had already undergone partial transformation processes that enhanced their physical capabilities and resistance to injury. These individuals demonstrated strength that exceeded normal human parameters and showed minimal response to pain or cold that would incapacitate ordinary people. The enhanced members fought with desperation and ferocity that suggested they believed capture would prevent their spiritual salvation and condemn them to eternal suffering. Dr. Thorne was found in the sanctuary chamber during the final moments of the assault, apparently in the process of undergoing the transformation ritual himself. His physical condition suggested that the process had progressed beyond normal human physiology, with altered circulation patterns that allowed survival despite blood loss that should have been fatal. Medical examination revealed that his digestive system had been modified to process human blood as a primary nutritional source, while his bone structure and muscle density had increased significantly. The children rescued from the compound required extensive medical and psychological treatment to reverse the effects of their indoctrination and physical conditioning. Several children had undergone partial transformation processes that left them with enhanced cold tolerance and altered dietary requirements that necessitated ongoing medical supervision. The psychological impact of their experiences included dissociative disorders and attachment difficulties that required specialized therapeutic intervention spanning several years. Official records of the Chandalar mining camp incident described the Brotherhood as a criminal organization engaged in child endangerment and fraud, with the supernatural elements of the case classified and removed from public documentation. Dr. Thorne was convicted on multiple federal charges, including kidnapping, child abuse, and racketeering, though his medical condition required specialized incarceration in a facility equipped to manage individuals with unusual physiological requirements. Amora left Alaska immediately after the case conclusion and relocated to a warmer climate, where she continues to work in child protective services, specializing in cases involving religious manipulation and cult activity. She has provided consultation to federal agencies investigating similar cases throughout the United States, though she refuses to discuss the supernatural elements of her experiences in Alaska. Her expertise in identifying and responding to cult recruitment tactics has been incorporated into training programs for social workers operating in remote communities where vulnerable populations may be targeted by extremist groups. The Chandalar mining camp remains under federal control, with access restricted due to alleged environmental contamination from the mining operations. However, satellite surveillance occasionally detects thermal signatures at the site during winter months, suggesting continued activity despite official claims that the facility has been permanently abandoned. Local native communities have incorporated warnings about the site into their traditional knowledge systems, treating the area as spiritually dangerous and advising against travel in the region during polar night periods. The Brotherhood's ideology has reportedly influenced other groups throughout Alaska and northern Canada, with federal authorities monitoring several organizations that combine Arctic survival techniques with supernatural belief systems. The pattern suggests that the extreme isolation and harsh conditions of polar night periods create psychological vulnerability that can be exploited by charismatic leaders, offering both practical survival assistance and promises of transcendence beyond human limitations. Enhanced surveillance and intervention protocols have been implemented to identify and respond to similar groups before they can establish fortified compounds or conduct transformation ceremonies that endanger both members and surrounding communities. Aviana Reed had been working as a wildlife biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for 11 years when she accepted what seemed like a routine assignment to monitor caribou migration patterns during the winter of 2020. The research camp, designated Station Echo 3, was located on the remote tundra of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, 200 miles northeast of Fairbanks, and 50 miles from the nearest human settlement. What Aviana discovered during the darkest weeks of the polar night would challenge everything she understood about the natural world. and leave her questioning the boundaries between scientific observation and supernatural experience. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge represented one of the last truly pristine wilderness areas in North America, spanning 19 million acres of untouched tundra, mountains, and coastal plain. During winter months, the region experienced complete polar night for over 60 days, with temperatures regularly dropping below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The research camp consisted of 3 insulated structures designed to house scientific equipment and provide basic survival facilities for researchers conducting long-term wildlife studies in extreme conditions. Aviana's mission was to document the winter behavior and population dynamics of the porcupine caribou herd, which numbered over 200,000 animals, and followed ancient migration routes between Alaska and Canada. The research required monitoring radio-collared caribou using tracking equipment, conducting aerial surveys when weather permitted, and documenting feeding patterns and habitat usage during the harshest period of the Arctic year. The isolation was absolute, with communication limited to weekly satellite phone check-ins and emergency radio contact with Fairbanks. The first indication that something was wrong came on December 5th, 3 days after Aviana's arrival at Station Echo 3. While conducting routine equipment maintenance outside the main research facility, she began hearing what sounded like human voices carried on the Arctic wind. The voices were distant and unclear, but they had the cadence and intonation of people speaking in conversation, rather than the random sounds typically produced by wind interacting with the landscape. Initially, Aviana attributed the voices to auditory pareidolia, the tendency for humans to perceive meaningful patterns in random sounds, particularly in environments of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. However, the voices persisted across multiple days and occurred under various weather conditions, suggesting they were not simply products of wind or other natural acoustic phenomena. The voices seemed to be calling from different directions around the camp, creating the impression of multiple individuals moving across the frozen landscape. What made the phenomenon particularly unsettling was the apparent content of the voices. Although the words were unclear due to distance and wind interference, the emotional quality suggested distress or fear, with tones reminiscent of people calling for help or expressing urgent warning. The voices occurred most frequently during the darkest hours of the night, when visibility was limited to the range of artificial lighting around the research station. Aviana attempted to locate the source of the voices using night vision equipment and thermal imaging cameras, but the sophisticated monitoring devices detected no human heat signatures or movement in the surrounding tundra. The landscape appeared completely empty of life, yet the voices continued with increasing frequency and apparent proximity to the research camp. The contradiction between audio and visual evidence created a sense of unreality that began affecting Aviana's ability to conduct her scientific work effectively. The situation escalated on December 10th, when the voices became clear enough to distinguish individual words and phrases. Most disturbing was the realization that the voices were speaking in English, rather than an indigenous language that might be expected from local populations. The speakers appeared to be calling specific names, including Sarah, Michael, and David, with increasing desperation and urgency, as if searching for missing companions in the Arctic wilderness. Research into the names being called revealed connections to previous researchers and wildlife personnel who had worked in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge over the past several decades. Sarah Mackenzie had been a biologist who disappeared during a research expedition in 1987. Michael Torres was a pilot who vanished during a supply flight in 1994. And David Chen was a research assistant who died of exposure after becoming separated from his team in 2003. The voices appeared to be calling for people who had died or disappeared in the region years earlier. The psychological impact of this revelation was profound. Aviana found herself questioning whether the voices represented some form of supernatural phenomenon or if the extreme isolation and harsh conditions were causing her to experience auditory hallucinations related to the tragic history of the region. The station's medical supplies included psychiatric medications designed to treat isolation-induced psychological disorders, but taking such medication would compromise her ability to conduct research and potentially endanger her survival if her cognitive function was impaired. Aviana's attempts to record the voices using sensitive audio equipment produced recordings that contained no identifiable human speech, only the normal sounds of Arctic wind and weather. However, during playback, she could clearly hear the voices that had been absent from the original recording session. This suggested either equipment malfunction or a phenomenon that could not be captured by conventional recording technology but remained audible to direct human perception. The crisis deepened on December 15th when the voices began calling Aviana's name specifically, demonstrating knowledge of her identity that should have been impossible for any external source to possess. The voices addressed her by her full name, referenced her educational background and research experience, and showed familiarity with personal details about her family and professional relationships. The level of intimate knowledge suggested either supernatural omniscience or access to confidential information from sources unknown. More disturbing was the content of the messages directed at Aviana personally. The voices warned her about dangers at the research station, provided advice about equipment maintenance and survival techniques, and offered guidance about conducting her research in extreme conditions. The information was consistently accurate and helpful, suggesting that whatever intelligence was behind the voices possessed genuine concern for her welfare and extensive knowledge of Arctic survival methods. However, the voices also began requesting that Aviana venture away from the safety of the research station to investigate specific locations on the surrounding tundra. They claimed that important scientific discoveries awaited her at coordinates they provided, including evidence of previously unknown wildlife species and archaeological sites that would advance her research significantly. The temptation to investigate these claims was balanced by awareness that leaving the station during polar night conditions could easily result in death from exposure or becoming lost in the featureless landscape. The breakthrough in understanding the phenomenon came when Aviana discovered historical records of similar incidents at research stations throughout the Arctic region. Government databases accessed through her official research credentials contained classified reports of scientists and researchers experiencing auditory phenomena at remote locations during winter months. The incidents followed consistent patterns: isolation-induced auditory experiences that began with distant voices and progressed to direct communication with entities claiming to be deceased researchers or explorers. The classified reports suggested that the phenomenon was not limited to psychological breakdown but represented genuine environmental conditions in certain Arctic regions that enabled communication across temporal or dimensional boundaries. The voices appeared to be consciousness remnants of individuals who had died in the region, preserved within the electromagnetic field generated by the interaction between the Arctic environment and cosmic radiation during polar night conditions. Scientific analysis of the phenomenon indicated that the extreme cold, electromagnetic activity from aurora displays, and isolation from conventional energy sources created unique atmospheric conditions that could theoretically support forms of consciousness independent of biological substrates. The research suggested that human consciousness, under specific environmental conditions, could persist after physical death as organized energy patterns within the Earth's magnetic field. Aviana's ordeal reached its climax on December 18th, when the voices began providing increasingly specific instructions about joining them permanently in their electromagnetic existence. They explained that her scientific training and research experience, made her valuable to their community of consciousness explorers who continued to study Arctic phenomena after physical death. The process would require her to abandon the safety of the research station during the coldest and darkest period of the polar night, allowing the extreme conditions to facilitate the separation of consciousness from biological form. The voices provided detailed explanations of the transformation process, describing it as a form of scientific evolution that would grant access to research capabilities and observational perspectives impossible within the limitations of human biology. They claimed that previous researchers who had undergone the transformation continued to contribute to scientific knowledge through supernatural observation and data collection that surpassed conventional research methods. The temptation to accept the voice's invitation was balanced by scientific skepticism and survival instinct. Aviana recognized that following their instructions would almost certainly result in death from exposure, regardless of whether consciousness preservation was possible. However, the voice's intimate knowledge of her research and personal background, combined with their consistently accurate information about Arctic conditions, made it difficult to dismiss their claims entirely. The resolution came through an emergency evacuation initiated by Aviana's failure to maintain scheduled communication with authorities in Fairbanks. Search and rescue teams reached Station Echo 3 on December 20th and found Aviana in a state of severe psychological distress, but physically unharmed. Medical evaluation revealed symptoms consistent with isolation-induced stress disorders, but no evidence of equipment malfunction or external interference that could explain her experiences. The research station was permanently closed following Aviana's evacuation, with official reports citing the psychological dangers of extended isolation during polar night conditions. The sophisticated monitoring equipment was removed and analyzed, revealing no technical problems that could account for the auditory phenomena. However, electromagnetic readings from the station showed unusual patterns consistent with theoretical models for consciousness preservation within magnetic field structures. Aviana left Alaska permanently and now works as a research coordinator for a wildlife conservation organization in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in temperate forest ecosystems that do not require extended isolation or exposure to extreme environmental conditions. She refuses to discuss her experiences at Station Echo 3 publicly, but has provided consultation to government agencies investigating similar incidents at remote research facilities throughout the Arctic region. The Station Echo 3 site remains under federal monitoring, with access restricted due to alleged research protocol violations during Aviana's expedition. However, subsequent researchers working in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge report hearing distant voices during polar night periods, particularly in areas where previous personnel have died or disappeared. The phenomenon appears to be a consistent feature of certain Arctic locations, though government policy focuses on containment and psychiatric treatment rather than scientific investigation of the underlying mechanisms. Aviana maintains contact with other researchers who have experienced similar phenomena, forming an informal support network for scientists whose careers have been affected by encounters with unexplained Arctic conditions. The group advocates for systematic study of consciousness preservation phenomena, while acknowledging the significant risks associated with direct investigation of the conditions that enable supernatural communication in extreme environments. The voices at Station Echo 3 continued to be reported by aircraft pilots flying over the region during winter months, though official policy prohibits investigation of the phenomenon due to safety concerns and the classified nature of previous research. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge remains one of several locations in Alaska where the boundary between scientific observation and supernatural experience appears to be permanently compromised, creating ongoing challenges for researchers working in regions where extreme isolation and environmental conditions may enable forms of consciousness that transcend conventional biological limitations. Oakland Morrison had been flying bush planes throughout Alaska for 16 years when she accepted what should have been a routine charter flight to the remote Inupiat village of Point Barrow in January 2021. As an experienced Arctic pilot certified for extreme weather operations, Oakland specialized in providing essential transportation services to isolated communities that depended entirely on aircraft for medical evacuations, supply deliveries, and emergency services during the harshest months of winter. What she encountered during a rare winter lunar eclipse in the northernmost reaches of Alaska would forever change her understanding of what lurked in the darkness beyond civilization's reach. Point Barrow, now officially known as Utqiagvik, sits at the very top of Alaska on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, making it the northernmost settlement in the United States. The community of 3,000 residents experiences polar night for over 2 months each winter, during which the sun never rises above the horizon and temperatures routinely drop below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The village's isolation is profound, with the nearest road system over 300 miles away and aircraft serving as the only reliable connection to the outside world. Oakland's charter had been arranged by Dr. Sarah Chen, a medical researcher from the Centers for Disease Control who needed urgent transportation to investigate reports of a mysterious illness affecting multiple families in the village. The symptoms described in the initial reports were unusual and concerning: rapid onset anemia, extreme sensitivity to light, and behavioral changes that included aversion to traditional foods and increasing aggression toward family members. Local health workers were overwhelmed and requesting immediate assistance from specialists with experience in epidemic disease response. The flight from Fairbanks to Point Barrow normally took 3 hours under optimal conditions, but winter weather often extended travel time significantly due to storms, visibility issues, and the need to navigate around dangerous weather systems. Oakland's Cessna 207 was equipped with specialized cold weather modifications, including auxiliary heating systems, extended fuel capacity, and emergency survival equipment designed to sustain passengers for days in the event of a forced landing in the Arctic wilderness. The January 20th lunar eclipse was a rare astronomical event visible from the Arctic region, occurring during the peak of the polar night, when the moon provided one of the few sources of natural light in the continuous darkness. The eclipse would turn the moon a deep red color, creating an eerie illumination that would be particularly dramatic against the stark white landscape of the Arctic tundra. Local weather conditions were predicted to be clear, providing optimal visibility for both the eclipse observation and the charter flight. The first indication that something was wrong came during Oakland's approach to Point Barrow, when air traffic control failed to respond to her radio calls. The village's airport was equipped with standard communication equipment and maintained regular contact with aircraft throughout the day and night, making radio silence highly unusual and potentially dangerous. Oakland attempted to establish contact using multiple frequencies and emergency channels, but received no response from ground control or any other aircraft in the area. Visual approach to the village revealed that most buildings were dark, with only scattered lights visible in windows throughout the community. The normal activity around the airport, including ground crew and terminal operations, was completely absent despite the fact that Oakland's charter had been scheduled and confirmed through proper channels. The runway lights were operational, allowing for a safe landing, but the abandoned appearance of the facility suggested that something had seriously disrupted normal operations. After landing and securing her aircraft, Oakland attempted to contact Dr. Chen via satellite phone to confirm arrival arrangements, but received no response despite multiple attempts. The airport terminal building was unlocked, but appeared to have been hastily abandoned, with personal belongings and equipment scattered throughout offices and waiting areas. Coffee was still warm in the break room, and computer screens displayed active flight tracking systems, indicating that evacuation had occurred very recently. Oakland's investigation of the village revealed a disturbing pattern of abandonment that affected the entire community. Houses stood empty with doors left open, and possessions scattered as if residents had fled quickly without taking time to secure their property. Vehicles remained running in driveways, suggesting that whatever had prompted the evacuation had occurred suddenly and created sufficient urgency that normal precautions were ignored in favor of immediate departure. The village's medical clinic, where Dr. Chen had planned to conduct her investigation, showed signs of recent activity but was now completely deserted. Medical equipment had been left running, and patient files were scattered across examination tables as if medical personnel had been interrupted during the middle of treating patients. Most disturbing was evidence of significant blood loss in several examination rooms, with staining on floors and medical equipment that suggested hemorrhaging or violent injuries had occurred recently. The lunar eclipse began at approximately 10:30 p.m., casting the abandoned village in an eerie red glow that transformed the familiar Arctic landscape into something alien and threatening. The blood-red moonlight revealed details that had been hidden in the normal darkness, including what appeared to be drag marks in the snow leading from various buildings toward the outskirts of the community. The tracks suggested that residents had been moved or had moved themselves away from the village center toward areas that would normally be considered too dangerous for human habitation during winter conditions. Following the tracks led Oakland to a disturbing discovery approximately 2 miles from the village center. The entire population of Point Barrow, nearly 3,000 people, had gathered in a natural depression in the tundra that provided some shelter from Arctic winds. However, the gathering was not a normal evacuation or emergency response. The residents were organized in concentric circles around a central area where some form of ritual or ceremony was taking place under the red light of the eclipsed moon. The central area contained what appeared to be an altar constructed from ice and stone, surrounded by containers that held dark liquid, which Oakland realized was human blood. Several individuals, including children, were lying motionless on the ice while others moved around them performing what looked like medical procedures. However, the procedures involved extraction of blood rather than treatment, with the extracted blood being collected in containers and distributed to other community members who consumed it directly. Most disturbing was the realization that the community members performing and participating in the blood consumption appeared to be functioning normally, despite environmental conditions that should have been rapidly fatal. The temperature was minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill factors that would cause frostbite within minutes. Yet many participants were wearing minimal clothing and showing no signs of cold injury. Their ability to function in lethal conditions suggested either supernatural protection or physiological changes that enhanced cold tolerance beyond normal human parameters. The lunar eclipse reached totality at 11:47 p.m., bathing the scene in deep red light that made the blood consumption ritual appear even more nightmarish. During the peak of the eclipse, the community's behavior became more frenzied, with participants moving with inhuman speed and demonstrating strength that exceeded normal human capabilities. The transformation appeared to be connected to the eclipse itself, as if the red moonlight was catalyzing changes in their biology or consciousness. Oakland's attempts to approach the gathering were detected despite her efforts to remain concealed, and several community members began moving toward her position with speed that made escape difficult. However, their approach was not immediately hostile, instead appearing curious or welcoming, as if they wanted her to join the ritual rather than harm her. When they spoke, their voices carried the same familiar accent and speech patterns of the Inupiat residents she had known for years, but their words described the ritual as necessary for survival during the polar night. According to the participants, the blood consumption provided protection against the extreme cold and enhanced their ability to survive Arctic conditions without conventional heating or nutrition. They claimed that the practice was based on ancient knowledge passed down through generations of Arctic peoples, though it had been suppressed by modern government authorities and medical establishments that did not understand its necessity for survival in extreme environments. The ritual participants explained that Dr. Chen had arrived as scheduled, but had chosen to participate in the ceremony rather than investigate it as a disease outbreak. According to their account, she had recognized the blood consumption as an adaptive response to environmental challenges rather than a pathological condition, and had undergone the transformation process herself to better understand its physiological effects. They indicated that she was present among the participants, but had been changed by the process in ways that made her difficult to identify. The physiological changes described by the participants matched the medical symptoms that had prompted the CDC investigation: anemia due to blood donation, light sensitivity from enhanced night vision, and dietary changes reflecting altered nutritional requirements. However, the participants described these changes as beneficial adaptations rather than disease symptoms, claiming that the transformation enhanced their survival capabilities and eliminated their dependence on external support systems during harsh Arctic conditions. As the lunar eclipse began to wane and normal moonlight returned, the intensity of the ritual decreased, and participants began to disperse back toward the village. However, many individuals remained changed by the experience, displaying enhanced physical capabilities and altered appearance that suggested permanent physiological modification. Their skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality that seemed to glow faintly in darkness, and their eyes reflected light like nocturnal animals. Oakland's escape from the scene was facilitated by the participants' lack of hostility toward her presence, though several individuals approached her with offers to undergo the transformation process herself. They claimed that her aviation skills would be valuable to their community, and that the enhanced cold tolerance would allow her to operate aircraft under conditions that would normally be impossible for human pilots. The transformation would allegedly grant her supernatural navigation abilities and eliminate her dependence on conventional aircraft heating systems. The return to her aircraft was complicated by the realization that several participants had followed her, apparently hoping to convince her to remain in the community permanently. Their arguments emphasized the practical benefits of the transformation for someone working in Arctic conditions, including immunity to cold injury, enhanced night vision for navigation, and strength that would allow aircraft operations under extreme weather conditions that would normally ground conventional pilots. However, the transformation process they described required voluntary participation in blood consumption rituals during specific astronomical events, with the lunar eclipse providing optimal conditions for successful physiological modification. Missing the opportunity during the current eclipse would mean waiting months or years for similar conditions, during which time Oakland would remain vulnerable to the environmental hazards that the transformation would eliminate. The decision to leave Point Barrow was influenced by the recognition that staying would almost certainly result in undergoing irreversible physiological changes that would fundamentally alter her humanity. While the enhanced survival capabilities offered practical advantages for Arctic aviation, the cost in terms of dietary requirements and social isolation from normal human communities made the transformation unacceptable despite its benefits. Oakland's departure from Point Barrow occurred as the lunar eclipse ended and normal lighting conditions returned to the Arctic landscape. The community members who had followed her to the aircraft made no attempt to prevent her leaving, but warned that she would not be able to survive future Arctic operations without the protection that transformation provided. They predicted that continued exposure to extreme conditions would eventually force her to accept the necessity of physiological adaptation. The flight back to Fairbanks was uneventful, though Oakland noted unusual readings on her navigation instruments that suggested magnetic interference consistent with the electromagnetic effects of aurora activity. However, no aurora displays were visible during the flight, and the interference patterns did not match typical geomagnetic